Hello everyone, welcome to my talk about General Data Protection Regulation and Test Data Management. My name is Franca-Sofia Fehrenbach and I would like to show you first my agenda. First, I will point out some important facts about test data management. Why are we facing so many TDM issues these days? And how can we solve our problems? The second topic will be about the GDPR itself. I will point out the most important facts you need to know about the General Data Protection Regulation, and I will also point out what consequences it will have on test data management. And last but not least, I will talk about the test data management challenges, and I will explain how to establish a proper TDM strategy. Okay. So let's start with test data management. Why are we facing so many TDM issues these days? We as Tricentis have been talking about it for years, but the acceptance of the industry was limited. One of the reasons is that for tests, the manual testers needed to deal with the test data management. They needed to prepare and create their test data that fits for their test. And this process of creating appropriate test data for your tests is really, really time consuming. It's actually so time consuming that most testers in fact spend up to 75% of their manual test effort just for the test data preparation. And they only used a quarter of their time for really executing their tests. And as long as people test manually, they won't be aware of the test data issue and the effort they really invest in this topic. And now, you heard Wolfgang's keynote, right? Everyone goes for automation. And as soon as you tackle test automation, you also need to prepare your test data properly. Because if you don't prepare your test data for your test automation, you will run into the phenomenon very famous already, it's called false positives. So can anyone explain me what false positives actually mean? Come on. What does it mean? False positives occur when the test case produces fair results, but there's actually nothing wrong with the app under test. So let's have a look at this number. 75%. 75% false positives in an enterprise test portfolio. This is the average number, meaning 75 out of 100 test cases go wrong without pointing to any error. And there can be 3 reasons for that. The first reason is the maintenance. If you have a lack of maintenance, if the test cases are not properly maintained, you will have a lot of false positives. The second reason is insufficient test data. This is why we are here too. And the second reason is your test environment is not sufficiently available. And you will run into these 3 problems sequentially. First, you will have, of course, the lack of maintenance issue. If you were able to solve this problem, you will run into a test data management problem. And if you are able to solve this problem as well, you still need to deal with a test environment. And the GDPR drives this TDM problem even further. So, General Data Protection Regulation. I want to explain 3 main key words which I will use. First, data subject. A data subject is an identified or identifiable person. A data controller is a person or organization who is in the possession of personal data and determines the purposes for which and the manner in which any personal data are processed. And last but not least, the data processors. Any person who processes the data on behalf of the data controller. So, 9 things you really need to know about the GDPR. First, it is replacing the Use Data Protective Directive, which has been in force since 1995. This directive, does not really account anymore for the way we are using technology and data today. So the EU comes up with a new regulation. It's a regulation and a directive. So what does that mean? Directives are implemented on a national level, whereas regulations are passed in Europe and automatically becomes legally binding for each member state. So yeah, there's no way around it anymore. There are not a lot of differences in the interpretation anymore. It is a clear regulation and it counts for every state. And it captures a lot of personal data. So what means a lot? There has been a long-running debate regarding which data should be considered as personal. The GDPR states that personal data does not only include any information relating to a data subject, but also includes online identifiers such as IP addresses and unique device identifiers. It has extraterritoriality. So what does that mean? Extraterritoriality means it does not only apply to organizations within the EU, but also to organizations outside the EU. So it has a global effect. Of course, not to all organizations outside the EU, only organizations that deliver services or goods to any EU data subject. It applies to data processors. So the current EU legislation only applies to data controllers and does not affect data processors. The GDPR wants to make clear that data processors also play a critical role in protecting EU citizens' data. And therefore, it will introduce several rules to support this. Data breaches must be notified. So if you're an organization and you notice that you have a data breach, you have the duty to report this data breach to a supervisory authority. And this must happen within 72 hours. Data exports aren't getting any easier. So you have to make sure that you protect the data. So businesses in general are prohibited to transfer data outside the EU if the data protection is not enough. Of course, what is enough? There's a long-running debate about it, but still you need to take care about any data which you want to transfer outside the EU. And there are massive fines. It can be up to 4% of the global annual turnover. I have here an example. So using the 2016 Tesco Bank as an example, had GDPR been in effect at that time of the breach, Tesco could have potentially been liable for fines up to 1.9 billion pounds. So 4% of the global annual turnover can really hurt. And last but not least, individuals' rights are strengthened. This is a huge topic. There are a few changes in data subject rights. I want to take a closer look at it. We start first with the right to access. So under the current EU legislation, people or individuals have the right to access, block, delete, and change their own data. This will also be the same when the GDPR is in place. But the GDPR wants to expand these rights. What does that mean? Data subjects as a data subject, you're allowed to obtain the data controller's confirmation if your data is processed or not, and even where it is processed and for what purpose. The right to be forgotten, also known as the right to erasure. That means basically you can request you can send a request to the organization and tell them you want that your data should be deleted, and they need to delete it. It doesn't matter if there is any compelling reason for its deletion or not. Oh, sorry, misclicked. Data portability. So you are allowed to receive the personal data concerning you, and you're also allowed that your data is transferred from one IT environment to another IT environment, not only transferred, also copied or moved. And this, of course, must happen in a safe and secure way. Breach notification, I already mentioned it. An organization has the duty to notify the data breach within 72 hours to a supervisory authority. Privacy by design. Yeah, this topic has a long history. The GDPR makes clear that privacy needs to be built in natively into product and services. So it also will affect the development and not only the testing world. Okay, and when will this be in force? On the 25th of May next year. So I have a quick slide about the GDPR in comparison to other countries. And definition of personal data. In the EU, personal data means any information related to a natural person. In the US, it means anything that can be used to contact or distinguish a person. And in Australia, any information about an identified individual. So there are still some differences. Collection and processing. In the EU, it's important what is stored, of course, under the GDPR now. Yeah? What is stored, where is it processed, when was it collected, and who uses it, and for what purpose. In the US, pre-collection notice and opt-out for use. And in Australia, why is it collected, who uses this, and what for? So this is pretty similar to our one. Breach notification, as I already said twice, within 72 hours. In the US, it's just required, no more definition. And in Australia, not even a legal obligation. Okay, so how will it affect a tester? Just assume you're a tester and you have a specific authority level. But the question here is it enough? Or to rephrase it, can this tester do his job with the authority level he currently has? So, as you know, testers need a certain authority level to do his job. But a high authority level grants access to personal data as well. And access to personal data violates the GDPR restrictions. So you also need to consider that, the authority level of the testers. I will talk about that later in the last topic, in the last section, when I talk about the dynamic masking processes, where you need to consider the authority levels of the users. A real-world example. Back in 2015, Kitty Care, a company from the UK, wanted to create a new website. And yeah, of course, they wanted to test the website, and they had a testing environment to test their website, right? And yeah, they had a breach, they had a security breach, and this breach exposed real customer data, and 800,000 customers were affected. And yeah, everything got exposed, names, addresses, contact details, anything. 800,000 people got exposed. And yeah, when this happens under the GDPR, you can imagine how high the fines will be, right? So what consequences will it have on TDM? Of course, productive data is no longer applicable for testing if it contains any personal data. And you need to pseudo-anonymize your test data. Okay, so what does that mean? How can we design a good test data management strategy and still consider the GDPR rules? When we come to a customer and the customer has TDM issues, what is the first thing he's going to do? He panics and he's looking for the right tool to solve his problems. But this won't help. The right tool won't help. It is all about the concept. You need to write the right concept. And it's not easy, we know that. Having a good TDM concept is really difficult, and you need to think about it, but it's worth it, and you need to do it. And there are different scenarios with sensitive data. And these different scenarios also require different methods of data protection. So the primary purpose of data is to work with it in production. The GDPR, of course, cannot prohibit that. You need your data in production, right? But, yeah. But there is something for that. We call it dynamic masking. I already mentioned it earlier. And there's also the secondary use. Secondary use means you use your data for testing purposes. And there are two different approaches. You use the synthetic test data generation, or you use the persistent masking. I will now explain the two different masking techniques. First, I will start with dynamic masking and then the persistent masking. So, masking strategy, dynamic masking. When you use the dynamic masking procedure, let's call it that way, then you change the appearance of the data, but not the data itself. So you leave the production database untouched. You anonymize the data depending on the authority level of the user. As an example, really easy example, I know, but to understand it, you have in the production database on the left the real values, of course. And there are some users who need to work with the production data because they have to do it, which is okay for the GDPR. And then you just give, for instance, the analyst, you give him the right data. But an IT administrator, for instance, just need the last 4 digits, as an example. And through a dynamic masking process, you just give him the last 4 digits. And an offshore support doesn't need to know the real numbers at all, so you just mask everything. You completely change the values. So dynamic masking is nothing else just to react on the level of the user and change the data for its purpose. Persistent masking is completely different, of course. You permanently change the data from the production database. You anonymize the data. And if a user then works with this anonymized database, there's no risk left because there's no sensitive data anymore. And there can be no, if there is a data breach, there are not really production data anymore. So what should happen? This is the persistent masking. How can it look like? Well, it's pretty easy. You just change the data. Of course, you need to still consider stuff, but in theory, you just change the data and you anonymize it. And you have several techniques for that. You can shuffle the values as you've seen it for the ID. You can substitute values. You can use for every Smith a Willis or for every Jones a Davis. You can use constant values for the city, or you can, for credit cards numbers, there are of course special techniques you can use. But keep in mind, the data, it should be a one-way process, right? It's not allowed, of course, that it is possible to go from an anonymized database back to the production database. It's a one-way process, of course. Right. So how does this fit into GDPR? The 4 key points: risk reduction. You minimize the sensitive data footprint. Consent, use customer data for the purpose it was intended. Security, ensuring only authorized individuals have access to sensitive data. This was basically the dynamic masking. And erasure, removing an individual's association to a data record. So one way, not both ways. So now let's talk about the TDM implementation. How can we implement the proper TDM? Basically, we have 2 sides. We have the supply side and we have to have the administer side. First, I will focus on the supply side, and later on the other one. On the supply side, you have 2 different approaches. You have the top-down approach, which is basically the data extraction and masking process itself. And you have the synthetic test data generation, the bottom-up approach. So what do you think is the best way to create your test data? Of course, you try to create your test data synthetically as much as possible and just fill the gaps with the top-down generated data. Why? Because you have several challenges. There are several challenges you have to face when you work with the top-down approach. Some of these challenges are listed here. You need extensive knowledge of all databases and systems. It is really complex, time-consuming, and you have a high risk to fail. The test data might not be in the golden copy, and if it is in the golden copy, you might not have enough for a daily test run. And last but not least, you need to extract the right data. I want to go exactly in this topic, because at an enterprise level, you have a lot of systems, you have a variety of systems, and they all interact with each other. And these systems have a high level of redundancies. And yeah, these redundancies, you also need, of course, to consider in the masking process. So normally, usually people have something like an enterprise integration layer in between, and it takes care of the orchestration data delivery, and it makes sure that your data is consistent. And now, when it comes to masking, it can be really tricky, because you need to also consider these redundancies in the different systems. And you have basically two options to deal with it. You can build the whole logic, the whole orchestration logic, you can rebuild it, but then you will have this maintenance nightmare, because whenever things change in the bus, you need to change your masking process as well, and you need to adapt the changes in the process. Option 2 is you let the enterprise integration layer play in your favor. Means you use the orchestration logic that is already here and inject data through the APIs. That means that the enterprise integration layer that is already here takes care of the data consistency, and you don't have to take care of it by yourself. I'm running out of time, therefore I need to hurry a bit. But right side, you have to administer the test data as well. So administer test data means basically you need to have a stateful test data engine, okay? What is stateful test data? Complex test processes require test data in certain well-defined states. When registering test data in TDM, a status needs to be assigned to it. And the test data, of course, is altered through the test itself, which we also call consumption of test data. So how can this look like? On the bottom, you have your stateful test data management. For your test, you read stateful test data that fits for your test. You use this test data to test the system on the test, and afterwards, you register the state changes in your TDM. Okay, very important slide, because I go back a bit and just think about it. We had on the left side the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach, right? We had the synthetically data generation approach, and we had the masking and extraction of data as the top-down approach. So is it really possible to cover a lot of risk with just using the synthetically test data generation approach? And I extra prepared a slide for that, because yes, it is possible. This slide is about the risk coverage that can be provided by tests through synthetic test data. And as you can see, the risk coverage is really high. It's 97% for transportation, 98% for retail, 92% for insurances, 96% for telco. Only for banks, it is a bit lower due to data history. So really, synthetically test data generation is really an approach you should consider. And the GDPR, of course, goes hand in hand with it, because there is no risk, because you don't use real customer production data, right? So the core conclusion is, whenever you can go synthetic, do it. The only constraints will be to automate the provisioning of test data and the historical data, especially when it comes to banks. So TDM is more about the right concept than the right tools. Think about it. And as a summary, test data management is the next big thing to solve as soon as automated test cases are here. If you start automating and you have not a properly prepared test data, you will have a high level of false positives. Productive data are no longer applicable for testing if they contain personal data. Last but not least, TDM is more about the right concept and the right tools. Whenever you can go synthetic, do it. And of course, our architecture, we are happy to help. We provide a stateful test data management engine, and we also, of course, can automate the synthetically approach. We can automate the provisioning of test data. And we also are able to integrate other tools if you want to use the top-down approach. Thank you.